They found him buried in the snow, eyes wide open, body frozen stiff, no collar, no tracks, no explanation, just a German shepherd lying where no dog should survive. The woman who pulled him out had never seen him before, but the moment their eyes met, something ancient stirred, like a memory that didn't belong to either of them, but bound them both. Why was he there? Who left him? And why, despite everything, did he wait? As this story unfolds, let us know in the comments where you're listening from. And if you believe some souls are meant to find each other, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. It was early February in the highlands of northern Montana, where the wind didn't howl, but whispered through the pines like something lost and still searching. Snow clung to every surface like a forgotten name, thick and unmoving, and the sky hung heavy with pewter clouds that hadn't broken all week. Near the edge of Elk Run Forest, about 7 miles from the closest paved road, a solitary log cabin sat quietly among the drifts. It belonged to Ellie Thompson, a woman who had long since stopped expecting visitors. Ellie was 42, tall with a quiet grace, her auburn hair now streaked with gray and often pulled back in a fraying braid. Her eyes were a muted green, soft and reflective, as though always listening to something no one else could hear. Once a beloved elementary school teacher in Helena, she had left the city behind after a series of losses carved too many hollows in her life: her mother's stroke, her brother's accident, and a classroom shooting that she survived but never truly left behind. That morning, Ellie was hauling firewood from the woodshed, boots crunching across the frozen ground, her wool coat layered over thick thermals, and her gloved hands numb despite the effort. She paused near the edge of the tree line when she spotted something strange, a long, uneven furrow in the snow, as though something had been dragged or had crawled, desperately. Her breath caught, not from fear but from the strange, urgent stillness in the air. Setting down the firewood, she followed the line of disturbance with cautious steps. The trail led her about 30 feet deeper into the brush, where the snow had softened slightly near a rock outcrop. There, barely visible beneath a thin crust of ice, lay a shape. At first, she thought it was a large fallen branch, or a heap of discarded tarp. Then it moved, just slightly, and her stomach twisted. It was a dog, a German shepherd. The animal's fur was mottled gray and black, caked in snow, with streaks of ice clinging to his flanks and tail. He looked young, maybe 2 or 3 years old, but gaunt in a way that spoke of hard weeks, not natural leanness. One of his ears stood upright, while the other drooped slightly, and his eyes, dark amber, dull, and resigned, locked onto Ellie as she knelt beside him. He didn't growl, he didn't flinch, he didn't even blink. He simply lay still, his chest barely rising beneath the frost-covered coat. "Oh God," Ellie whispered, heart thudding against her ribs. She dropped to her knees and pressed a hand gently to his side, warm but fading. Carefully, she slid her arms beneath his body, startled at how light he felt for his size. His legs dangled, limp and unresisting, as though he had used the last of his strength just to get here. Ellie staggered upright, cradling him against her chest, and began the slow walk back to the cabin. She didn't speak to him, not yet. Words seemed too heavy. Inside the cabin, she cleared a space by the stove and laid him on a wool blanket. The fire had burned low, but warmth still radiated through the stone hearth. She stoked it quickly, then fetched towels, a bowl of warm water, and her old first aid kit. As she worked, peeling ice from his fur and dabbing at small cuts along his legs, she noticed something odd. Along his left flank, hidden under the dirt and dried blood, was a row of faint, pale scars. Clean, straight, surgical. Her breath stilled. This dog hadn't just been lost. He had been somewhere. Somewhere precise, somewhere cold. She whispered as she worked, murmuring nonsense more for her own comfort than his. "You poor thing. Where did you come from? Who did this to you?" The dog lay still through it all, his breathing shallow but steadying. When she reached for a flannel throw to cover him, he finally blinked. Not in pain or fear, but as though surfacing from some place far away. She met his eyes again and found herself inexplicably moved. There was something in the way he looked at her, not pleading, not broken, just waiting. She made him a bed in the corner and sat by him for a long time, unsure what to do next. Snow tapped gently against the window panes. Outside, the world remained unchanged. But inside that room, something had shifted. Later that evening, as twilight dimmed the sky, she placed a bowl of water beside him and watched as he nudged it with his nose but didn't drink. She sighed and sat on the floor beside him, arms resting loosely around her knees. "I guess you need a name," she said quietly, "but not just yet. You don't feel like mine to name." Still, in her mind, a word surfaced. Ash. Not because of his color, though his coat was streaked like burnt wood, but because he looked like something left behind after fire. Fragile, and yet not gone. Ellie didn't say it aloud, but the name stayed with her. That night, as the wind picked up over the ridges and coyotes howled faintly in the dark, Ellie remained beside the German shepherd, listening to the rhythm of his breath, feeling the strange ache of recognition that she couldn't explain. He didn't belong to her, but he was here, and maybe, just maybe, that meant something. The next morning came with the hush of snowfall, steady and thick, draping the pine forest in silence that softened every sound. Inside the cabin, warmth flickered from the stove as Ellie Thompson stirred a pot of oatmeal, glancing now and then toward the corner where the German shepherd lay curled. He had not moved much during the night, but when she approached, bowl in hand, she found his eyes open and steady, following her with quiet awareness. His body remained still, yet his gaze was clear. Ellie placed a dish of water near him, then crouched down and gently slid the bowl of food beside his head. He didn't leap for it, nor sniff in curiosity. Instead, after a long pause, he sat up slowly, cautiously, and took small, precise bites, as if calculating the cost of each motion. As the morning wore on, Ellie busied herself near the hearth, arranging kindling and feeding the fire, pretending not to watch him, but she saw it all. The way his ears rotated minutely toward every creak in the floorboards, how his head turned slightly when a squirrel scrambled across the roof, how he always kept one eye on the door. It wasn't fear. It was something colder, sharper. She remembered that kind of vigilance. Her brother had returned from 2 tours in Afghanistan with eyes just like that, eyes that never fully settled. When Ellie dropped a spoon onto the hardwood floor by accident, it clattered with a sharp clang. The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't flinch. He turned his head smoothly, registered the noise, and resumed his stillness. Ellie narrowed her eyes. It wasn't normal. Most dogs would have startled, even barked. She stood up and took 2 steps into the center of the room. "Let's try something," she murmured. She set her mug down, then stood tall and lifted her right hand, palm forward. The shepherd stared. She lowered her hand slowly. The dog sat immediately. Ellie blinked. "No way," she repeated the gesture, but this time with her left hand and a slight curl of her wrist, something she had seen in an old military documentary about dog training. Without hesitation, the dog lay down, ears forward, body alert but still. Ellie took a breath and walked backward a few paces. She tried another signal, raising 2 fingers, then pointing to the side. The shepherd crawled forward 3 feet, slow and precise, stopping exactly when her fingers dropped. She stared, both hands falling to her sides. "Where did you come from?" she whispered. The dog's ears twitched again, but he didn't move. Ellie felt a deep weight settle over her chest. This wasn't learned by accident. This wasn't a shelter dog with some lucky training. Whoever this dog had been with before had taught him more than tricks. They had taught him to be ready for anything. That evening, snow still falling outside the windows, Ellie sat with her old notebook at the table, flipping through pages she hadn't looked at in years. Her late husband, Thomas, had worked briefly as a civilian contractor for a defense firm in Denver. He rarely talked about his work, but sometimes he'd left behind old manuals and protocols, bits and pieces of programs that always made Ellie uneasy. There had been a binder marked Canine Response Evaluation, Tier 3, with diagrams of dogs reacting to gesture commands under stress. She had thrown it out after the funeral, wanting nothing left of that chapter. Now she wished she hadn't. She looked across the room at the shepherd, who now lay near the stove again, stretched out on a folded blanket. His breathing was steady. His coat, after cleaning, had revealed an ashen saddle pattern with deep black markings along his back and face, classic to the breed. But the eyes, still amber, still watching, held none of the puppy softness she expected. There was something in those eyes that had already seen too much. The next day, she decided she couldn't carry this unease alone. She opened the junk drawer by the kitchen and dug out a battered phone she rarely used. Its screen was cracked, but the battery still held life. She scrolled through old contacts until she found one that made her pause. Dr. Sam Ritter. A retired veterinarian now living outside Miles City, Sam had once been involved in behavioral rehabilitation for working dogs. He was also an old friend of Thomas's, and though they hadn't spoken in years, Ellie trusted him. She dialed the number. It rang 4 times before a voice answered, gruff and familiar. "Yeah? Sam, it's Ellie Thompson." "Well, I'll be. Haven't heard your voice since Thomas's memorial. Everything okay?" "I found a dog," she said, and then hesitated. "Number I didn't find him. He found me, maybe. But there's something strange. Something trained. I think I don't know." There was a pause. "You want me to take a look?" "I do," Ellie said softly. "I think you'll know what I mean when you see him." "All right," Sam replied. "I'll be there tomorrow." As she ended the call, Ellie looked back at the shepherd. His head was up now, ears tilted toward her, eyes still and deep. He hadn't moved, but he had heard. She could tell. And for the first time since she found him, Ellie felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, not confusion, but the faint ache of beginning to understand. The sky over Elk Run cleared the next morning, revealing an unbroken stretch of white powder glistening beneath soft winter light. Ellie Thompson stood on her porch with a mug of coffee in hand, eyes scanning the trail that led down toward the road. She hadn't slept much. Her thoughts circled endlessly around the shepherd, now curled beside the stove inside. Ash. She had said the name aloud just once. And though the dog hadn't visibly reacted, something in the room had stilled when she did. Now, as she waited for Dr. Sam Ritter's arrival, her heart carried a tension she couldn't explain. By late morning, a battered gray pickup rolled up the path, wheels crunching through the crusted snow. Sam Ritter stepped out slowly, brushing snow from his brown canvas jacket. He was in his late 60s, with deep-set eyes behind square-rimmed glasses, a close-trimmed beard flecked with white, and a frame still sturdy from decades of farm work and backcountry hikes. He had the look of a man who'd spent his life learning to move quietly, who knew how to listen before he spoke. Ellie opened the door before he could knock. "He's inside," she said, her voice low. Sam stepped past her with practiced ease and walked straight toward the stove. Ash lifted his head slightly but didn't rise. His eyes followed the stranger with quiet calculation. Not fear, but something more discerning. Sam crouched beside him, not reaching out, just observing. "Well now," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "You're not just somebody's backyard pup, are you?" Ellie stood behind him, arms crossed tightly. He reacts to hand signals, cleanly, precisely. I tried 3 gestures, I remembered from one of Thomas's old manuals. He followed everyone. Sam nodded once, then slowly extended a hand, palm up, giving Ash space to choose. The dog sniffed, then placed his chin gently into the man's palm. Sam smiled faintly, then ran his fingers down Ash's flank with care, pausing when he reached a line of pale scarring. "This was surgical," he said, voice tightening. "Not recent, not sloppy either. Someone knew what they were doing." He leaned in, parting the fur carefully to inspect further. "And look here, scar tissue just under the skin where a chip might have been. Removed cleanly. No inflammation, no infection. That's not something you see in a street rescue." Ellie exhaled, her breath shaky. "I thought so." Sam sat back on his heels. He's young, maybe 3. Solid build, well-muscled under the weight loss. Ears intact, teeth good. His reactions are controlled, almost professional. He's watching everything, even when he seems still. My guess? He was trained in containment, probably for protection, possibly for specialized response. She stepped forward. "Trained by who?" That's the question. Ellie moved to the old cabinet near the fireplace and pulled out a wooden box, one of the few things of Thomas's she had kept. Inside were notebooks, some military field guides, and a weathered leather folder marked with the faded initials, Tet. She handed it to Sam without a word. He opened it slowly. Inside were pages of scribbled notes from Thomas's time working with a private defense contractor called Gray Line Strategic. The notes detailed a proposed canine program labeled Guardian Response, aimed at pairing dogs with children in conflict zones or evacuation centers. The dogs were meant to identify danger, shield their assigned child, and, if separated, return to a known safe zone autonomously. Sam whistled low. This isn't standard military protocol. This is black project stuff, civilian side, probably off record. Ellie nodded. Thomas never talked about it. He just said it made him uncomfortable, the way they were starting to talk about dogs like equipment, not lives. Sam flipped to a diagram, then tapped a page. Here, look at the cues. Hand signals paired with environmental triggers. That's how your boy responds. Whoever trained him didn't just teach obedience, they conditioned him to override instinct. They sat in silence for a while. The fire popped softly in the stove. Ash stretched out beside it, his ears still tilted toward every word. Finally, Sam closed the folder. There's one more thing. If someone removed his chip and dumped him this far out, it wasn't because he wandered off. It was to keep him from being found. Ellie's stomach turned. You think someone tried to erase him? I think someone tried to make sure no one came looking, but he didn't forget. He came back from wherever they left him. Her voice faltered. But why here? Why me? Sam stood and laid a hand gently on her shoulder. Maybe because you're the first person who didn't give him a command. You gave him a choice. That night, long after Sam had gone, Ellie sat in the dim light of her cabin, staring at the notes Thomas had left behind. Ash lay at her feet, breathing slow and even. His body relaxed for the first time since he arrived. She brushed her fingers over the page labeled Emergency Recall Protocol. She didn't know yet what Ash had been through, but she knew one thing for certain. He was not broken. He had simply been used and then forgotten, but not anymore. It was nearly dusk in the small town of Willow Creek, Idaho, and the storefronts along Main Street were beginning to flicker with warm lamplight. Snow rested in shallow piles along the sidewalk, and a slow wind rattled the bare branches of cottonwoods by the river. Inside a modest brick shop tucked between a bakery and a florist, Grace Miller stood behind the counter of her paper goods store, sorting through a delivery of handmade cards. She moved with practiced grace, her fingers slender and methodical, though they trembled slightly when the music on the radio shifted to a familiar tune. She was 50, with soft hazel eyes and shoulder-length ash blonde hair usually pulled into a loose knot. Her face carried the gentle weight of someone who had lived a full life, but now spoke only in half sentences and polite smiles. 4 years ago, she had lost her son in a tragedy the government called an accident. Lucas Miller had been 23, a bright, generous young man with a mechanical mind and a heart too big for rules. He had volunteered for a defense research program after college, working with experimental canine units focused on child protection in high-risk zones. The last time Grace saw him was on a rainy April morning, his boots wet, his grin steady, and a German shepherd by his side named Ranger. Lucas never came home. The official report cited a facility explosion due to critical systems failure, but no body was recovered. The dog, they said, had been reassigned. No further details. No calls returned. Grace had written letters to military bases, to agencies, to anyone whose name she found on old envelopes. Most were ignored. A few came back with stamps marked undeliverable. She kept them all in a box beneath her bed. That evening, Grace returned home to her small white house on the edge of town. The porch light buzzed faintly as she unlocked the front door. The living room still held all the pieces of the life she had once shared with Lucas. A frayed blanket he'd used as a teenager, his old books stacked in crooked towers, and in the center of the mantel, a framed photo of him kneeling beside Ranger, the shepherd's tongue lolling out in a half-smile. She fed the kettle and sat at the kitchen table with her tea, then opened the drawer where she kept her unanswered letters. She didn't expect a miracle, but something inside her refused to stop asking. That night, just before sleep, she found herself staring at the photo again. It wasn't just the shape of the dog, it was his eyes. She had once joked that Ranger looked like he'd seen the world twice and still chosen to trust it. The next morning, a brown envelope arrived without a return address. Inside was a blurry photograph, printed on thin paper, showing a cabin in the woods. The quality was poor, taken from distance, but she could make out a tall woman in a red parka standing near a German shepherd by a woodpile. Grace's heart pounded. The dog had the same stance, the same way of leaning forward slightly with ears cocked, and a coat that looked worn but familiar. Beneath the photo was a single sentence typed in block letters. Sighted in Elk Run, Montana. Shepherd matches Asset R1 profile. She didn't pack much. A duffel with clothes, the photo from the mantle, and Lucas's old training journal. She left a note for her assistant at the store and got in her dusty silver Subaru, the one Lucas had fixed the brakes on himself. The road to Elk Run was long and winding, and she drove mostly in silence, letting the snow and the hum of tires keep her steady. She stopped for gas just outside the national forest and asked a park ranger about cabins near the northern ridge. The young man at the counter, barely 20 and smelling of coffee and wood smoke, scratched his chin and said, "There's a woman lives up that way. Not many folks do. Quiet type. Keeps to herself. Got a dog that doesn't bark." That was all Grace needed. She followed the directions along a snow-packed road, finally parking at the bottom of a ridge where the tires began to slip. She hiked the rest, boots crunching through crusted ice, the air sharp in her lungs. When the cabin finally came into view, she stopped and caught her breath, not just from the climb, but from the quiet certainty that she had found something she never expected to find. She approached slowly, her heart thudding. She didn't knock at first, just stood there, watching through the narrow kitchen window. Inside, a tall, auburn-haired woman stood pouring water into a pot on the stove, and near her feet, a German shepherd rested, head lifted, ears rotating gently toward the sounds around him. Grace took a breath and raised her hand. She knocked, once, then again. Ellie opened the door. Her expression was cautious, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the stranger on her porch. Grace didn't wait for an invitation. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the photograph. "I think you have my son's dog," she said. Behind Ellie, Ash rose to his feet. His body stilled, his head tilted. Grace's hand flew to her mouth. "Ranger," she whispered, though the name hadn't passed her lips in years. Ash took a step forward, then another. He didn't run, didn't bark, didn't wag his tail. He only stood there, breathing slow and deep, his eyes locked on hers. And then, for the first time since Lucas disappeared, Grace saw something she thought she'd never see again. Recognition. Snow had begun falling again in Elk Run, a steady, soundless hush that blanketed the trees in silence. Inside Ellie Thompson's cabin, the air was thick with something unspoken. Grace Miller sat on the edge of the worn armchair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while Ellie stood near the stove, arms crossed, watching Ash with a mix of awe and unease. The German shepherd hadn't taken his eyes off Grace since she arrived. He hadn't growled or moved, only stared, as though searching for the name buried beneath her voice. They didn't speak much that night. Grace showed Ellie the photograph and Lucas's training notebook. Ellie made tea, but no one touched it. Ash finally lay down near the door, but his ears never rested, flicking at the smallest creaks in the cabin. The fire snapped and crackled as the wind picked up outside. When they did sleep, it was shallow and scattered, haunted not by dreams but by the things they were finally beginning to remember. At dawn, something changed. A sound split through the calm, low and unnatural, a high-frequency pulse almost below hearing. Ash stood at once, rigid and alert. His body moved before his mind could catch up, drawn by the signal outside. Ellie shot up from the couch. Grace followed, her voice hoarse. "What is it?" Ellie's heart pounded as she pulled back the curtain. A black SUV had appeared beyond the trees, tires crunching the ice-covered path, stopping just short of the cabin's clearing. 3 men stepped out. They wore civilian clothes, but their movements were too synchronized, too smooth. One wore gloves and carried a black case under one arm. Another scanned the tree line with a narrow-lensed device. The third, taller, with pale eyes and clipped silver hair, stood still and watched the house without expression. Ash let out a low, guttural growl. It vibrated through the floorboards. Ellie dropped to one knee, placing a hand on his side. His muscles were tight, trembling. "Not yet," she whispered. "Not this time." The tall man approached alone, stopping a few paces from the porch. He didn't shout. Instead, he pulled a slim, dark remote from his pocket and pressed something. A second pulse filled the air, this one sharper, deliberate. Ash flinched. His legs jerked forward as if caught in an invisible leash. Grace stepped in front of him. "No," she said softly, her voice quivering. "Don't let them take you again." Ellie opened the door slowly and stepped onto the porch. "What do you want?" The man's voice was calm, clipped. "We're here for the dog. He's a government asset that went off-grid. We have orders to retrieve and return him. That's all." "He's not property," Ellie replied, her voice sharp. "He's not yours anymore." "He's dangerous," the man said. "He's conditioned for combat, and that makes him a liability. If you don't comply, this becomes a containment issue." Inside the cabin, Ash began to pace, agitated, torn between the voice outside and the women inside. Grace crouched down in front of him, placing both hands on either side of his face. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Ranger, look at me. You don't have to follow them. You remember who you are. You were never just theirs." Outside, the man pressed the remote again. A sharp click filled the air. Ash dropped to the ground, eyes wide, body rigid, breath stuttering in panic. Ellie stormed back in and slapped the remote from his hand. "Enough," she snapped. "You don't get to own what you tried to destroy." The other 2 men stepped forward, reaching inside their jackets. Ash's body jerked once more. He looked toward the door, toward the man, toward Grace. His body shook, as if every part of him was being pulled apart. And then Grace spoke again. "You choose now." Ellie stood beside her. "We're not giving you orders, we're giving you freedom." Ash stared at them both. For a heartbeat, he didn't move. Then something in his spine relaxed. His eyes sharpened. He let out a sudden, thunderous bark that shattered the stillness, then charged, not toward the women, but toward the man in the clearing. He collided with him at full force, knocking the remote into the snow, breaking the connection. The other 2 men froze. One reached for a weapon, but Ash turned sharply and growled with primal authority. They hesitated. Ellie seized the moment. She grabbed Grace's arm and pulled her down the back path behind the cabin. Ash followed a moment later, fleet and focused. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the ridge, where a narrow trail dropped into the frozen creek bed that curved toward the forest. Ellie knew the land. She had mapped every outcropping during her loneliest winters. They slipped into the woods, hearts racing, frost biting at their breath. Behind them, the cabin disappeared into the trees, and with it, the life Ash had nearly been forced back into. The cabin on the ridge had long disappeared behind them, swallowed by snow-laden pines and the hush of the Montana forest. Ellie led the way through the narrow creek bed, her breath white in the frigid air, boots cutting through thin layers of ice. Grace followed closely, one hand clutching her coat shut at the chest, the other gripping Lucas's training notebook pressed tight beneath her arm. Ash stayed near, his movements fluid and alert, no longer trembling from the signal, but watching for any sound that didn't belong to the wilderness. They hiked in silence for over an hour, until the trees thinned and the trail opened onto a long-forgotten ranger station perched above the frozen lake, a wooden structure weathered but still intact, its roof lined with wind-blown needles, and a rusted stovepipe reaching toward the pale sky. They slipped inside. The old interior held the scent of cold pine and damp wool, but it was safe and dry. Ellie moved quickly, gathering firewood from the crate near the door and lighting the stove with trembling fingers. Grace found a wool blanket draped over a bench and wrapped it around herself before sitting cross-legged on the floor. Ash circled the room once, sniffing the corners, then settled near the fire, chest rising and falling in slow rhythm, his eyes on the door. They spent that day inside the ranger post. No one spoke of what might come next. Grace stared at the cracked window while Ellie flipped through Lucas's notes, skimming symbols, short commands, and margin doodles of a dog with one upright ear. Time passed with the light. At dusk, Ash stood and walked over to the table, nosing the edge of the notebook. Grace turned the page, revealing a short entry from her son that neither of them had read before. The handwriting was smaller, more careful. If anything ever happens, he'll find his way home, not to a place, but to the people who choose him, not command him. Ash pressed his paw gently against the page and sat. That night they took turns resting. Ellie dozed in a chair with her feet near the stove, while Grace leaned back against the wall, watching the firelight flicker across the boards. Ash did not sleep. He stayed still but awake, the kind of stillness only learned from surviving. He only relaxed when dawn painted the lake in soft gold and the wind shifted toward stillness again. By late morning, Ellie climbed the ridge to scout the road below. The black SUV was gone, no tracks but their own. She returned with a quiet nod. They're not here, not now. They packed what little they had and descended the other side of the slope, moving carefully through the thinning woods. Ellie had remembered a fire tower further south that no one used since the last wildfire. They made it by late afternoon. The tower was sturdy, the stairs creaking but strong. From its top, they could see the entire basin, the lake glinting in the distance, and the cabin now miles behind. The three of them stayed in the tower for 2 nights. On the second evening, Ellie turned to Grace, her voice low. "We can't run forever." Grace nodded slowly, fingers resting on Ash's back. But we can start over. Spring came late that year, but when it did, it melted the snow in thick rivulets down the mountain. They returned to a small property Ellie had once inherited from her aunt, tucked between 2 hills south of Townsend. The house was in disrepair but held good bones. Over the following weeks, Ellie and Grace worked side by side to rebuild it. Ellie handled the heavy lifting, cutting rotted boards, fixing the porch, replacing windows. Grace painted the rooms in soft colors and lined the shelves with books and little jars of dried herbs. Ash took to the land naturally, roaming its perimeter, patrolling the tree line like he had always belonged. One morning, a neighbor dropped off a basket of eggs and left a note at the gate. "Saw the dog. You got something special there." Another day, a school bus driver passing by waved to Ellie and asked if she'd be open to tutoring again. Grace took up writing letters once more, though now they weren't sent. She kept them in a box by the window, words folded around memories, addressed to Lucas but meant for no one. Ash began to sleep more deeply. He still flinched at sudden engine sounds or distant echoes from the hills, but the tremor in his limbs had faded. One evening, Grace fitted him with a new collar made of woven leather. She tied a tag to it by hand. It didn't say Ranger. It simply said, Ash, chosen, not commanded. That night, they sat by the fire, the 3 of them, with mugs of tea and the hush of evening pressing gently against the windows. Ash lay at their feet, his body stretched long, ears twitching only when the wind passed too hard through the valley. Grace reached down and touched his side. "You came back to us," she whispered. "Not because someone called you, but because you knew." Outside, the stars appeared, slow and patient, and in the quiet of that house made new by hands and healing, the past no longer whispered like a wound. It waited quietly at the door, finally at peace, because it knew it would not be let back in. Sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is let go of who the world told us to be and choose who we are meant to become. Love, in its quietest form, does not command. It invites, it waits, and it stays. Ash wasn't saved by orders or force, but by those who saw him not as a tool, but as a soul worth healing. If this story touched something in you, take a moment to subscribe and share where you're listening from. You never know who might be waiting to be chosen next.